Let's talk about wheel pommels, Viking hilts, and why you need to get with the program. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So what this video is inspired by is the fact that over the course of many years involved with swords of various different communities, I have noticed there is a general unliking for wheel pommels, okay, and a lot of particularly longsworders. Now if we go to a typical longsworder's tool, being the fedder or fedderschwert, most of these have forms of what should we call them, pear-shaped pommels, scent stopper pommels, things like this. You can get ones with wheel pommels, you can get ones with fishtail pommels, but generally speaking we go with those pretty easy ergonomic doorknob shaped kind of pommels, and so that is what a lot of HEMA people certainly are exposed to. Within reenactment or living history communities it's somewhat different, and I'll talk a little bit about adaptations that they make to hilts. But the simple fact is this: the fact is that wheel pommels, and grab a different wheel pommel this time, I grabbed the Albion Lancaster, wheel pommels were basically the most popular pommel throughout the entire period from about 1000 AD all the way through until the 16th century. And these were incredibly common, that you could find them everywhere on every type of sword. You found them on one-handed swords, you found them on long swords, you found them on big old bearing swords, all kinds of stuff. You found them on falchions, and wheel pommels were incredibly popular. But the fact is that a lot of modern people are not a big fan of wheel pommels at all. Now, there is something that we need to therefore ask, is why do people dislike them so much now? Is it that you're holding the sword wrong? Is it that you're using it wrong? Is that the replicas are not true to form, true to the originals, and there are certain things about the replicas which make them not particularly nice to use compared to the originals? Well, actually, for the latter part of that supposition, that kind of is, are the replicas true to form? I don't actually really see any evidence to suggest that they are not close to the originals. I've studied quite a lot of originals in my life. I've been very lucky to hold some of the original Castillon swords, for example, of which this is kind of inspired by. So I have held a bunch of original period swords which have wheel pommels on them. Now, before I go on, I want to just tip my hat to Roland Vorcheka, who has made some interesting observations about wheel pommels and about them sometimes not being in line with the blade and having a slight cant on them or twist on them relative to the alignment of the edges. And something that he has put forward as a possible idea is that sometimes sword makers were deliberately twisting the pommels relative to the edges, the front and back edge, the plane of the blade, in order to make them slightly more ergonomic. Now, why would that be? Well, for those of you who don't hold swords regularly or necessarily do anything with swords physically, of which obviously a lot of people watching this channel are interested in this stuff but don't necessarily do it, where the problem lies is that a lot of people find that this inner, or rather outer edge of the wheel pommel here conflicts with the heel of the hand when holding it. So when you perform a cut and extend and cast out the sword, that rubs and aggravates, creates a hot spot on that part of the hand. Now if you twist the pommel so that back side of the pommel is now twisted away, okay, that doesn't happen anymore. So absolutely, I think it's a fascinating theory, and looking at originals, Roland has shown that many, or at least some originals, do conform to this. However, this is the flip side. Not all of them do. And many of them actually go the opposite way or don't twist at all. And so I don't think that this was a universal thing. Do I think that it was just accidental? I think that's possible as well. The simple fact is that we're obsessed with symmetry, and for example the quillon being precise to the you know, 0.5 millimeter length on one side as it is on the other, and that's not always the case with original medieval swords. With the midrib being precisely in the center of the blade, that's not always the case with medieval swords. With fullers always being perfectly straight, that's not always true with medieval swords. With fullers ending at the same side on each side of the blade, that's not always true with medieval swords. So the simple fact is we're obsessed with symmetry and perfect proportions more than they seem to have been. So I do think that the twist on the pommel that we see sometimes on original medieval swords is coincidental, accidental. Sometimes it could even be a sign of poor craftsmanship. But was it sometimes deliberate? It's possible. It's absolutely possible. But what we have to say is that wheel pommels were, nevertheless, whether they were twisted or not twisted, were absolutely the most popular type of pommel on medieval swords through certainly the 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th centuries and into the 16th century as well. Okay, and in the 16th century, we do indeed start to see other types of pommel start to become far more common. Now, in the 15th century, it's also worth noting that many swords intended for using with two hands, or at least some of the time with two hands, like this bastard sword, this is another Albion, the mercenary, do start to have pommels which very clearly are supposed to be ergonomic, so can be at least partially gripped by the hand that's at the bottom. And sometimes, indeed, we find these types of pommels on one-handed swords. So we find fishtail pommels, scent stopper pommels. We do indeed find those on one-handed swords. But even then, it seems that statistically, the wheel pommel was still the most common type of pommel in the 15th century on one-handed swords. Now, what I'm not going to attempt to get into in this video is why was the wheel pommel so popular? What did it signify? Was it something to do with design, culture, religion, spirituality, anything, you know? There are all sorts of things we can look at as to why the wheel pommel was so ubiquitous, so popular and universal during this period. But the simple fact is that wheel pommels come in many different forms. This is a fatter one, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But wheel pommels were hugely popular. So when people in HEMA or reenactment or anything else say they don't like wheel pommels, my answer is, well, tough. you need to, if you want to understand swords in the medieval period, in the period particularly of the HEMA treatises, 14th, 15th century, but the pre-16th century ones, you have to get used to wheel pommels and understand how wheel pommels work, how to grip them, the strengths and weaknesses of them, possible advantages, and possibly getting to an understanding of why they stuck with wheel pommels when they could have used scent stopper pommels, fishtail pommels, whatever. Okay, or just ones that are like a blob, like a round ball, of which is another type. So why were wheel pommels in their myriad of forms so popular? Why were they so prevalent, so continued to be used when other types of pommels were available? And if you don't like them, hard luck. If you want to understand the martial arts and the weapons and armour and everything else of the period, you have to accept some bits of armour are restrictive. Okay, certain types of gauntlet mean that you can't cut in certain ways or do certain things. There are certain bits of medieval technology that you simply can't do certain things with, contrary to what you might see in movies or anime or whatever. So that simply you have to accept the technology as it was and then try to understand it. That is the root of HEMA in many ways. It's trying to get into the mindset, trying to get into the technology and understanding the period and fully immerse yourself in what they used and how they used it to try and get an understanding of how that works. Now, how does this relate to Viking swords? Well, there's a very similar comparison here in that, and I've done plenty of videos about this in the past as well, Viking period swords often have grips which are only between 7 and 9.5 centimeters long. If you look at modern reenactment Viking swords, it is incredibly common for reenactors to have grips that are 11, 12, 13 centimeters long because they don't like the pommel. So it's the wheel pommel thing all over again. Oh, well, I don't like those pommels. I find they hurt my hand when I use them. So I'm just going to get the grip made longer so that I can use the sword how I want to use it. But that's missing the point. If you're doing reenactment or you're doing living history, you should be replicating the artifact of the period and then trying to understand how it was used. If you've got a sword that is a perfect replica of a Viking era sword, you can go for the longest historical grip that you can find, might be 9.5 centimeters. You can go for that, absolutely. Then use that sword, and if it's hurting your hand, well, you're probably doing something wrong. You're probably holding it wrong or cutting wrong. This sword doesn't hurt my hand because, as I've shown in previous videos, there's a certain way of holding these types of sword hilts. If you hold it in that way and you cut in certain ways, you'll find that it doesn't really hurt your hand anymore. However, a lot of people just just want to hold it like they're used to holding a stick. And then the bottom end of this Viking pommel, and it could be a Frankish or an Anglo-Saxon sword, doesn't necessarily have to be Viking or Scandinavian. This is probably a Frankish style sword. Actually, it was found in Ireland, so there's not necessarily anything Viking about it. But that point there can create a hot spot and dig into the hand if you don't hold the sword in the right way and use it in the right way. So coming back to wheel pommels, it's the same thing. If I actually take what I know from, or what I've my opinions on how to hold a Viking era sword, and I apply that to this particular quite flat, relatively in line with the grip type of wheel pommel, then it's absolutely fine. The same thing applies actually. That type of gripping methodology that I used for the Viking sword applies perfectly fine with this type of Castillon type 15th century hilt. And you'll notice, if we hold both these swords up, that in both these cases the Viking era pommel is about the same width as the grip, and in this case certainly the beginning of the wheel pommel is the same width as the grip. So despite the fact they're quite big in this direction and have projections here which could dig into the hand, if we look at them this way, they're quite close to the same width as the grip, and I think that's telling us something. But I want to caveat that with the fact that not all wheel pommels are like that. So this is closely based on the Westminster Abbey swords, often associated with Henry V. And you'll notice, despite the fact that these are both wheel pommels and look similar that direction, they look completely different from that direction. This is actually a partially hollow pommel, much, much thicker and wider. And in fact, there's a lot of variation between wheel pommels. Some wheel pommels are the same thickness all the way up, so kind of parallel. Some taper this way, so they get thinner towards the peen. Some actually get fatter towards the peen, and some are just overall much wider, like that. So it could be, obviously there's differences of taste in period, but it could be that not everyone was gripping their sword in exactly the same way. Now, we have to also note that this is also a period when the grip length of, particularly of arming swords, obviously of two-handed swords were already longer, but the grip length increases of one-handed swords. So in fact, if you've got a longer grip, the pommel doesn't necessarily encounter your hand anymore in the way that earlier period swords, if we go even back to the 14th, 13th century, particularly the 13th and earlier, then we find that sword grips are short, and therefore by necessity the pommel does encounter the hand. So the headline is this: if you don't like wheel pommels, if you don't like Viking sword pommels, well, get over it. If you want to understand that period, you want to understand those weapons, you've got to look at accurate replicas, and that includes the size and proportion and everything else of those swords of that period. And the simple fact is that if you've got a pommel, which is either a wheel pommel or a Viking era type pommel, and you have a short grip, that pommel is part of the grip. It does encounter your hand. There's no way you can avoid it. So the way that they gripped and used those swords must be connected to the design of that short grip and the design of that particular kind of pommel. And we have to understand that, whether we're doing HEMA and we want to get into trying to understand the fighting systems shown in the treatises, or whether you're doing Viking era living history and you want to understand how were Viking swords actually used, then you need to understand how to hold the weapon, how to use the weapon without hurting yourself. I hope this has been thought-provoking. I understand for some people this might go against some of your ideas and your opinions, or your gut feelings and emotions, the fact you don't want a sword to hurt you when you use it. So you just go with the easy option of choosing a different type of pommel. But maybe go with the type of pommel that was popular at that time, go with the grip length that was popular at that time, and try to change yourself instead of changing the weapon. Try and change yourself to get into a better mindset and understanding of how those weapons were actually being used. Thanks for watching. If you're not subscribed, please do so. I've got extra videos on Patreon. Click the notification bell on that subscription thing so you get notifications of new videos here. I hope I'll see you back here on the channel really soon for another video. Take care, folks.